Chapter 53. Growing Up. The return trip to the house was made in almost complete silence. The light of the morning sun was steadily growing brighter as it rose, warming the air and awakening Bibi's sleep-deprived senses. He periodically glanced to his sides at the Crusaders, ensuring for himself that they were still there. Each and every time he did so, he was met with the positive glows of their auras and the happy smiles on their faces, easing his fears. Still, he just had to check. His house eventually came back into view through the foliage, and a tiny worm of trepidation began to wiggle its way into his heart again. Bibi came to a complete stop at the edge of the forest, his body tensing up and his wings wavering on his back.
Bibi?
Sweetie asked him after a moment, kneeling down by his side to get a good look at his nervous face with concern on her own.
Are you okay?
Bibi stood still for a few more seconds before giving a stiff nod of his head.
Yeah, I'm nervous,
he admitted quietly, his eyes drifting down to stare at a small, round stone poking out between the blades of grass. Sweetie lifted her hand and reached out for him, though she hesitated a little just before she would have touched his shoulder. Bibi grimaced when the faintest taste of disgust tickled the tip of his tongue, and he gave her a sideways look. She saw his glowing blue eyes, and whatever disgust she felt quickly faded away. Her hand settled on his shoulder in a feather-light touch. It was hesitant, but no less genuine. And it was enough to impart some bravery back onto Bibi. He leaned into the touch a little bit, giving off an appreciative chitter, then set his eyes back on his home.
Okay, I'm ready,
he had told them before once again starting to walk. He led them around the fence, approaching the front door of the home. As they drew closer, Bibi's ears perked up a little bit. There was sound coming from within, just audible through the walls. Bibi strained his ears, trying to discern exactly what it was. It didn't take him long to figure it out. Eventide was moving around. Judging by the frequency of his steps, he was moving at a brisk pace. But there was more. He was talking. While Bibi could not decipher the words, he could make out the tone. He was anxious, almost frantic. Between that and the faint glow of purple, black, and dark blue through the windows, Bibi quickly put two and two together. Swallowing heavily, he turned back to his friends one more time.
You guys ready?
He asked, his voice shaking with built-up anxiety. Thankfully, his friends came through for him.
Totally,
Scootaloo replied with a confident nod of her head and her fist thumping into her chest. Sweetie Belle folded her hands in front of her and smiled sweetly down at Bibi.
We're here for you, Bibi,
she assured him, her voice setting him a little more at ease. Applebloom nodded as well, although hers was far more reserved than Scootaloo's. She took a step forward and knelt down to be closer to Bibi's eye level. She met his gaze.
I'm as ready as I'm gonna be. The question is, are you?
Bibi looked back at her for several seconds.
I think so.
Applebloom reached out and ruffled his head like he still had hair.
Let's do this thing,
she encouraged him before gesturing at the door. Bibi stared at her for a few more seconds, then smiled. With a quiet chirping noise, he pressed his forehead into Applebloom's chin in an attempt at a nuzzle. She seemed a little confused by the act at first, but quickly figured out what was going on. She returned the gesture as if it were a hug, lifting up one of her hands and patting Bibi on the back of the head. That done, and with Applebloom rising back to her full height, Bibi knew there was nothing else for it. He couldn't delay any more. So with one more deep breath, he spun to look at the front door of his home. Under any other circumstance, it might have made him feel safe and comfortable. But now, with what he knew he was going to have to confront beyond, the door seemed tall and infinitely imposing to him. His wings twitched one more time, and he had to force himself to not whimper. Anxiously, he lit his horn and pushed the door open. It creaked as it went, the sound echoing loudly in BB's ears. Just beyond the door, he could see Eventide coming to a stop mid-step in the middle of the room. He was still in his pajamas, and he was holding his phone up to his ear. His aura, which had been alight with anxiety and confusion mere moments ago, had completely stilled. There was nothing coming off of him. A sign of shock, maybe? BB took a few steps forward, crossing the threshold and entering his home. He heard the Crusaders moving along close behind him, but didn't look. He didn't need to see them to know they had his back. He could taste it. So instead, he kept his eyes locked firmly onto his father's as best as he could. Eventide looked back at them, his gaze darting between his son and his company, completely at a loss for words. Suddenly, Eventide jumped as if he had been startled. He took a moment to compose himself, then spoke into the phone. Sorry, Fluttershy, can I call you back? His eyes settled on BB, and his aura slowly began to light up with something. BB couldn't make it out just yet. I found him. Without saying goodbye, Eventide ended the call with a muted bleep, then let the arm holding the phone fall limp at his side. He stood there for several long seconds, staring at BB like a deer at oncoming headlights. The silence dragged on, and with every second that passed, the tension grew thicker. At last, Eventide cleared his throat and spoke to his son. BB? He said in a slow, neutral-toned greeting. BB looked down at the floor, his ears drooping.
Dad?
He replied, his own voice quiet and meek. The silence and tension came rushing back in, settling over everyone like an oppressive fog. BB could just hear the Crusaders shifting uncomfortably behind him, and he could taste their anxiety and fear overwhelming their confidence and determination from mere moments ago. Well, how did it go? Eventide eventually asked, his tone completely unreadable. Before BB could speak up, Applebloom suddenly stepped forward and took a place by his side.
Mr. Eventide, if you're worried that we might spill the beans about BB, don't worry, we won't.
She quickly explained, her voice shaking just a little.
He's our friend, and I swear to you right now, I won't tell anybody about this, alright? Yeah,
Scootaloo piped up, also stepping forward to BB's other side.
Our lips are sealed.
Sweetie Belle nodded along, taking her place directly behind BB. She spread her arms out and clapped her hands against the backs of the other two Crusaders.
Crusaders' honor!
A few seconds passed in silence before BB, wearing a goofy grin from the sudden flood of support, managed to look back at Eventide.
I think it went good,
he replied optimistically. His smile did not last, though, quickly fading away. His face fell, as did his tone of voice.
Dad, I'm sorry. You told me I couldn't do this, but I had to. It turned out fine, but...
Eventide hummed in quiet contemplation. He looked away for a few seconds, then addressed the Crusaders. Applebloom, Sweetie Belle, Scootaloo, you all wait here. BB, come with me upstairs. I need to talk to you in private. he commanded in a still unreadable voice.
Is he in trouble?
Scootaloo asked, leaning forward a little.
You're not going to ask him to stop being our friends, are you?
Eventide glanced at Scootaloo, his expression turning stern. No, I'm not. But I need to talk to my son. Alone. He repeated firmly before his eyes rested on BB. The two made eye contact, and it was then that BB finally began to discern the colors in Eventide's aura. It was largely a medium grayish blue with a few flickers of violet spread throughout, like flashes of lightning in a cloudy night sky. After a moment of hesitation, BB nodded his head and looked back at the Crusaders.
I'll be down soon,
he promised them before lifting into the air on his wings.
Good luck, baby,
Abalum called after him, making him turn around mid-flight. She was offering him an encouraging thumbs up, a hopeful look on her face. BB smiled appreciatively before spinning back around and flying after Eventide. The two were completely quiet as they ascended the stairs, the only sounds being BB's buzzing wings and Eventide's bare feet slapping against the wooden steps. They turned into the bedroom and Eventide closed the door behind them. Immediately, BB went to speak.
Dad,
Stop. Eventide interrupted him, though his voice was remarkably quiet. He looked down at BB, and finally, he could make heads and tails of the man's face. He looked sad, almost. Like he was resigning himself to something he really did not want to. BB tilted his head to one side.
Dad?
Eventide sighed heavily, then turned around to point at his bed. Sit down, B, he commanded simply before walking over and taking a seat himself. BB drifted over and did as he had been told, settling down next to Eventide on the edge of the mattress. To his surprise, Eventide draped an arm over him and pulled him against his side. BB looked up in confusion and saw Eventide's face smiling back down at him, albeit still with that edge of resignation visible in his eyes. They were like that for a short time before Eventide gave off a weak chuckle. Oh, BB. What in the world am I gonna do with you? He asked quietly before withdrawing his arm. BB's expression scrunched up in bewilderment.
Wait, am I not in trouble?
Eventide looked directly ahead, his face slowly shifting into something more stern. You did exactly what I told you not to do, BB, right after I told you not to do it, he stated plainly. His eyes flicked to look down at BB from the side. What do you think? BB wilted and looked down, his ears folding back and his ear wings drooping.
I'm sorry, Dad. I'm grounded, aren't I?
He asked quietly, one of his hooves absently brushing through the fabric beneath it. Eventide nodded his head. Yes, you are, he stated in a firm voice. But then, to BB's recurring confusion, Eventide reached down and lightly pet BB right at the base of his fin. But not until tonight. BB blinked, too nonplussed to fall prey to the sensitive spot on his neck. He shook his head to send away the invading hand and looked up at Eventide again.
But why?
Eventide looked down, his expression once again becoming unreadable. Consider it my apology, he admitted after a moment. BB's mind blanked, as did his face.
What?
Eventide didn't say anything yet. He rose, starting to pace back and forth in front of BB. He folded his hands behind his back, and his eyes remained glued to the floor. I was on the phone with Fluttershy last night, he began, speaking slowly and clearly. And She told me it would probably be safe to let the Crusader see the real you if I was there to supervise things. I was going to tell you this morning so we could start setting up a time. BB's eyes widened and his jaw fell open. So that was what Eventide had been talking with Fluttershy about. Eventide continued before BB could speak. Then this morning I found your bed empty, and I learned that you weren't even in the house, you were just gone. He continued, his voice starting to tremble somewhat. I panicked. I thought that maybe you'd gotten so angry with me that you ran away. I called Fluttershy, and she was just getting through calming me down enough to think straight when you came back with your friends.
I couldn't keep lying to them,
BB repeated for what felt like the millionth time. Eventide stopped his pacing and looked away, his face contorting with a pained grimace. I know. I've always figured we could probably trust them deep down, he said in a hushed voice, his shoulders sagging. BB's eyes widened before narrowing in disapproval.
Wait. If you thought we could trust them, then why did you say we couldn't? Why did you make it so I couldn't show them?
He demanded, his voice incredulous and appalled. Eventide visibly flinched from the questions, and his aura was suddenly flooded with a thick wave of intense guilt. BB froze, his eyes going wide at the sight. After a moment, Eventide sighed and lifted his eyes back up to his son. Let me tell you a little story, BB. He started again, his voice distant. He slowly strolled forwards and sat down next to his son again, though this time the bug backed away a few steps. Eventide hunched forward, clasping his hands together between his knees. He remained still for what felt like an eternity, but was really only a few seconds. His aura was flickering with so many emotions that it looked stunningly like a wild thunderstorm, and the tension was perfectly reflected in his face. Finally, though, Eventide let out a breath and began to speak. I love you, BB. More than anything or anyone else in the whole world. You know that, right? You're my son. You're easily the best thing that's ever happened to me. He glanced sideways at BB, a nostalgic look in his eyes. Do you remember the old place? You know, the old house we used to live in? BB's expression slowly began to soften.
Yeah, I remember. I kind of miss it sometimes,
he replied slowly, curious as to what Eventide was getting at. The man gave off a quiet chuckle. I don't. It was small, crummy, and even then I could barely afford rent because I had such a poorly paying job, he stated before shaking his head in disbelief. Kinda hard to believe I was happy with that. He looked at BB again. Do you want to know why it was so small, BB? Why I lived in such a small and not good house with such a poorly paying job? He asked, and when BB didn't answer, he continued. It was because I was afraid of letting people down. I didn't want to break my back for someone only to find out that I wasn't good enough, just like with my mother. I failed her and I had never felt worse in my life. I never wanted to feel like that again, so I let myself be perfectly content with living a life of mediocrity and borderline poverty. I was poor, had only a few friends, and I never took on any more responsibility than I had to. But then, completely out of the blue, you came along. His face relaxed with a nostalgic smile. His aura calmed down as well, simmering to mostly a dim pink shimmer. And suddenly, I had this new responsibility that, at first, I didn't want, but couldn't get rid of. I tried to pass you off to Fluttershy the day you hatched because I didn't want to look after you. Did you know that? BB nodded his head.
Yeah, I overheard you talking about that last night.
If Eventide was at all upset by the eavesdropping, it didn't show. He looked ahead at the wall, no doubt recalling memories from so long ago. Right. Well, I never got to give you up. You were way too clinging to let that happen. When Fluttershy tried to carry you out of that house, you bit her and scampered right back to hide behind my leg. Buddha and I were the first things you saw, besides that old basement, and you didn't want to be taken away. Fluttershy convinced me to look after you after that, and I didn't really have any other choice. I did. I was still scared, of course. You were adorable, and I was getting used to looking after you, but I thought you were a wild animal. And you kept throwing all of these surprises at me. What with you, when you molted out of your skin, your first sparks of magic. Really, I was just waiting for the day you were big enough to be released into the wild so I wouldn't have to worry about you anymore. Then you started talking. You showed us that you were a person, and everything changed. I wasn't looking out for an animal anymore. I wasn't raising a pet. I was raising a son. It wasn't about me or my happiness anymore. It was about you and your safety. I couldn't afford to let you down. I had to devote myself to you and... Eventide looked down at the floor, his eyes closing. I had to better myself to do that. I had to get a better job. I had to find a new and better home. Also, I could better take care of you. For the first time since I'd left my parents, I had something to work towards, and... He opened his eyes and looked over at BB again with a tear-filled smile. Something that made me happy. BB's eyes had gone as wide as dinner plates a long time ago. He was silent for a second, trying to find his voice.
Dad,
was all he managed to choke out. Eventide took advantage of the silence to keep talking. I've never loved anyone or anything as much as you, B. You came into my life and made it so much better in so many ways. He looked ahead, and his smile went away, leaving just the tears. I didn't want to lose that. Ever. And when I thought you ran away, I realized something. I've been too hard on you when it comes to showing yourself. I can think of at least 6 different people off the top of my head who could know about you and everything would be fine. Fluttershy's friends, mainly. They've dealt with so much magical stuff in their lives, you wouldn't even be a blip on the radar. BB tilted his head slightly, finally regaining some of his mental faculties. Enough to speak.
So... why not let me then?
He asked, his voice timid as if he were afraid that being too loud might shatter some immaculate piece of beautiful art. Eventide sighed and slumped in place. BB. Part of what's made me so happy is that you've needed me. I'm raising you because you're my son, and since day one, you've almost always needed me to be there for you. And as long as you needed me, I thought I'd have something to work towards, a responsibility to fulfill. He lifted his eyes for the door as if he were staring through it. I didn't want to let anything take that away. In the end, I was scared of you not needing me anymore. of you growing up. In a sad, roundabout kind of way, it started being about me again when it should have always been about you. I was just so dead set on protecting you from anything and everything that might have been a threat. And let your friends fall into that category. So I shut down your desires to show your true self to others because I know it means you're finally starting to grow up. And that means you're not going to be needing me as much anymore. That led me to make the same mistake my mother did. I started to shut you out. I stopped listening. And when I saw your empty bed this morning, He stopped, and to BB's shock, he heard the tiniest echo of a sob coming from his father.
Dad.
I thought it was too late. Eventide continued with a sniffle, turning to look at his son again. I thought that I'd already made my big mistake. You grow a lot faster than humans, so I was terrified that I'd driven you away like I felt my mom did to me. He looked down and shook his head before wiping the back of his hand over his eyes. With a shudder, Eventide straightened his posture, took a deep breath, and cleared his throat. But I learned my lesson. I get it now, he declared solemnly before sliding off the bed and kneeling by Ed's side. He faced BB directly, locking gazes with him. I am so sorry that things got like this, BB. But I promise you right here, right now, it will never happen again. I can't stop you from growing up. And neither should I try. And with that, Eventide finally fell silent. BB stared at him, completely shell-shocked from everything he had just heard. His jaw hung open, and he barely had the presence of mind to close it after a solid minute of silence. He then managed to offer his father a tiny smile.
I'm sorry too. I'm sorry I scared you when I left,
he whispered, taking a few steps forward on the bed. Eventide nodded.
Apology accepted,
he replied before glancing over at the door.
Now, I think you have some friends downstairs to spend some time with.
At the reminder of his friends waiting for him downstairs, BB's face lit up with a smile, and his wings gave a short buzz of excitement on his back.
Really?
Eventide looked back at him, a tiny flicker of mirth entering his aura.
Hey, they're your friends, not mine.
This is a big day for you.
You should go celebrate.
So go on. Play with them, joke with them, laugh with them, talk with them, just be with them. I won't get in the way. BB sat still for a second, processing those words. His eyes started to glisten with fresh tears, and his lips began to tremble. Then, with a shaky breath of his own, he kicked off of the bed and launched himself into Eventide's chest, hugging him around the neck and burying his face in his adoptive father's shoulder. The hug was returned immediately, and the love that came pouring out of Eventide this time was pure and untainted. There was just the tiniest edge of sadness left in it, but not nearly enough to make the flavor any less appealing. BB drank it down, purring with contentment and snuggling closer to his dad.
Thank you, Dad. Thank you so much. I love you,
he whispered quietly. A low and quiet chitter of unending affection could be heard coming from him when Eventide squeezed him closer.
I love you too, BB,
was Eventide's almost inaudible response. They stayed like that for almost a minute, basking in their embrace and the peace it brought. Then, with a happy and childish laugh, BB suddenly pulled himself up onto Eventide's shoulder and used it as a springboard. He flew right for the door, throwing it open with his magic and shooting down the stairs, his face split by a gigantic, ecstatic grin. Eventide stayed still for a good few seconds after BB left, his eyes distant and his smile gone. He'd committed himself now. There was no going back. He knew now that BB would probably never forgive him if he went back on his promise, thanks to Applebloom's influence. Applebloom. Eventide couldn't help but smile as he rose back to his feet and started to slowly follow BB back down the stairs, thinking of the farm girl and how much things had changed since she and BB had first come across one another. Not in the woods, he reminded himself, but through the window at the old house. That one incident, a brief meeting allowed only by pure chance, had been the proverbial kick in the rear that had motivated Eventide to seek new and better paying employment and a new house. In a roundabout sort of way, Eventide had her to thank for that decision. He had her to thank for all of the steps he had taken to finally improve his living situation for the sake of his son. As he arrived at the bottom of the stairs, he could hear BB and the Crusaders laughing and cheering amongst themselves in jubilation. He stepped out into the archway leading to the living room, and he couldn't help but smile at the sight. He leaned against the frame and just watched for a while. BB was currently hugging Sweetie Belle around the neck, the pale-skinned girl spinning around in circles while returning the embrace. She looked to be a little off balance, indicating that she had been tackle-hugged. Scootaloo was in the middle of doubling over while pumping her fists in a victorious pose, and Applebloom looked like she had just gotten done being hugged by BB herself. She was adjusting her shirt and straightening it out. As she finally got herself sorted, she looked up towards the archway. Eventide made eye contact with her, and for a second, everything else faded away for the two of them. They just stared at each other for a long time, searching the eyes of the other. Before Applebloom could say anything, though, Eventide just smiled and nodded his head towards his son. Getting the message, Applebloom nodded her head and went to join her other friends in the rapidly forming group hug. Eventide felt the urge to go and join them, but this time, he held himself back. His eyes then drifted over to one of the end tables by the couch, and he saw that his camera was there. Seeing that, and seeing the scene playing out before him, made an idea spring into life in his mind. With his smile returning, he marched over and took the camera up in his hands before turning to the group hug. "Hey guys," he called over to them, drawing their attention. "What's up?" Scootaloo asked, poking her head up from the back of the group. Eventide held the camera up over his head in one hand for them all to see. "Mind if I get a picture of this?" There was a general and excited vocalization of agreement with that plan, and after some shouting over each other and a lot of scrambling, the Crusaders and BB found themselves in a suitable arrangement on the couch. BB sat on his haunches in the center, a big smile on his face and his wings splayed out on either side. Sweetie sat to his right side, a demure smile on her face. Scootaloo stood behind the couch, a large and cocky grin on her face, while to BB's left was Applebloom, one of her hands resting comfortably on his back, and her other lifting up, holding up her index and middle fingers for a peace sign. Eventide smiled at the sight for a moment, before lifting the camera and taking the picture.